you do need to understand Freud and Adler before you go near Jung.
If you stay with the fantasy and the woo-woo, you don't ever really solve the problem.
No, you don't.
You just keep somebody trapped.
No, it frames everything. It's like, can you individuate alone? Maybe, probably not.
Yeah.
You know, because, and again, if you ground it in biology, it becomes obvious.
Yeah.
Yes.
He created psychological types as a way of understanding Freud and understanding Adler and how they came to create their theories based on their personal life and experience.
You can't have an individuation relationship without sex.
One of the things we've spoken about on this channel many times is like how it sort of began, what the original audience was.
Yeah.
I was thinking about you know, the original boyo audience, if you like, and how people come to this kind of stuff. And it's like, well, they start with Carl Jung, but they start with the end of Carl Jung's career, of course, or like Ion or something like that. You were just saying before we put the camera on about why it's more important to study Freud before even studying Jung, even Jung's earlier works or something like that. So to start at almost the very, very beginning, right? Yeah.
Well, Jung himself said that you should start with Freud and you should understand Freud and indeed Adler before you go anywhere near him. And it is progressive in that sense. There are good practical reasons for why that should be the case. If you avoid doing it, it will cause problems in your understanding. So let's just get that absolutely clear. You do need to understand Freud and Adler before you go near Jung. Jung is decontextualized if you look at him without looking at the other two. And despite the fact that Adler was the first principal defector from Freud and then Jung was, and that suggests that there was something wrong with Freud, nevertheless Jung himself said that he incorporated Freud's learning, his understanding, his model in broad terms. Yes, he modified it, but he did incorporate it. Now that's on the theoretical level, but on the practical level there's another issue which is really, really important, and that is that those three actually map out stages of psychopathology at which people can become fixated. So I'll give you a broad paint stroke of this. With respect to Freud, if you don't deal with Freudian issues in terms of your own development, you will not be able to reach the level of Alfred Adler. If you then don't reach the level of Alfred Adler and deal with the pathology which is represented by his psychological model, you will not be able to reach Jung authentically. So if you don't do this and you just go straight to Carl Jung's model, there are two huge gaps in your thinking and your understanding straight away. The way to think about it, again in broad brush terms, is that Freud's approach is fundamentally instinctive and biological and developmental in that ordinary sense. It is the foundation of everything. When you get to Adler, you're looking at something completely different. You're looking at social adaptation and understanding. And then when you get to Jung, you're looking at the transcendence or the transpersonal. If you start with Jung, you're making a mistake if you haven't gone through the other two phases. Because any complexes that you've acquired, any maladaptations in your life that are Freudian will not be solved that way through Jung. Any Adlerian issues that you've not solved will not be will not be solved by Jung. It's anticipated that you've understood and gone through those phases of development before you get to Jung. So that's a hugely important issue which is not commonly understood or appreciated, but it should be.
So if we're talking about, say, first of all, the Freudian stuff, would you say that's fundamentally then your psychosexual development and the family, familial constellation?
Yes, it's that, and it's also the general idea of libido as well, and a ceiling that people might have. I mean, Paul and I have met plenty of people who have basically Freudian issues of adaptation.
Yes, are you thinking of one couple in particular?
Well, that's an example that would illustrate it, but this particular woman was so Freudian in her needs and in her character and her personality that she would never, ever, ever in a million years get anywhere near understanding Carl Jung at all.
It wasn't going to happen. I know who you're thinking about, so it wasn't going to happen.
And it's not, although it might have been in her case, an issue of intelligence either. It's really to do with where somebody's pathology generally lies. And with her, it had to do with gratification in a Freudian sense. Absolutely, with that. And because she could not exceed that, because she hadn't ever dealt with it, she was still in the repetition compulsion cycle of Freudian libido. she couldn't progress to the stage of Adler, which is really about being social and about understanding and appreciating other people, just in broad terms. And of course overcoming issues of inferiority and superiority, getting that balance right. The social interest elements, she had no interest in anybody other than herself. It was all about gratification. So for her to achieve a Jungian level of understanding was absolutely impossible. And then you get people who can get as far as Adler, and they have social interest, and they've worked through their instincts, their basic drives, their early adaptations. They've struggled with that and they've achieved it, and they're on the Adlerian level to do with power and with what Adler called the masculine protest, all this kind of thing. And they may then aspire to get to Jung, but they can't understand him because they haven't fully integrated Adler. They're on the level of working at that level, and they may think, well, I've sorted out my basic early adaptations to life and to instincts and so forth. I should be able to learn about Jung, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work because they haven't fully integrated the Adlerian level. Again, that shows, and it has its specific pathology. And then you get people who start with Jung, and they're full of Freudian and Adlerian psychopathology, and they try to tack Jung onto that when that's not been completed. It just doesn't work. The Freudian complexes are still there, or the Freudian drives and frustrations. Of course, with Freud, there's only one complex, the Oedipus complex, but in a broad sense, complexes which are affected and delivered and modulated by Freudian drives. And also they may not have sorted out their sense of inferiority, they haven't developed social relationships properly, and they're trying to go into the transcendent, the transpersonal, the spiritual, and all the other things that the end of Jung's path, the end of Jung's opus was directing itself towards. You even get this in analysts. There are a lot of Jungian analysts out there who are really people who are possessed with, for example, Adlerian pathology. They're interested in politics, they're driven by politics, the power principle runs their life, but they are Jungians, and you can see the gap. It's huge because they haven't resolved that issue, they haven't overcome it, they cannot authentically live out a Jungian approach to life at all. So
yeah, well, the couple I think you were thinking of, you were working with the gentleman concerned in a Jungian way.
Yes.
But he clearly still had Adlerian pathology.
He did as well.
He did as well. Yes. He had Adlerian issues, but was insisting on working in a Jungian way.
Yeah.
And I think, as you were suggesting, his wife very clearly had Freudian issues. And it was an interesting case, really, because you could say on the surface that she appeared to have social interest. She was certainly sociable.
Oh, yeah.
But I think the important point there was that it was all about her own gratification. So it wasn't about getting on with people or relating to people. She actually had problems with boundaries, actually.
Oh, very much, yeah.
Very much so. And any kind of social interest that she had was purely self-serving.
Yes, it was.
And we couldn't get her beyond that point, because it would have been too difficult, I think, to get her to admit that for a start, because it's quite a humiliating thing to have to accept that you might still be functioning at that level and really just looking to gratify your own needs. It's a difficult thing to get across to somebody without appearing to be offensive.
Yes, it is.
And I think that in and of itself clinically was very inhibiting.
Yeah, it was. He had the Jungian aspirations.
He did, yeah.
He had his own pathology, which was principally expressed in an Adlerian way. And then you had his wife, who had this issue over gratification and loose boundaries.
Yes.
But she was operating pathologically through Adler as well, because she was controlling him.
Oh, without a doubt, yeah. Yeah.
So she expressed both pathologies, but she couldn't even satisfy Adler, if you like, because Freud was so operant through her. And I don't mean to denigrate Freud by focusing on pathology, because Freud is much maligned. His understanding was very, very broad, very deep, and neuroscience is catching up with Freud now at last, but that's another story. But with respect to the expression of pathology and being fixated, her principal drive and her principal wound, if you like, was at a Freudian level that she could not resolve. Therefore, she couldn't help him at an Adlerian level. She could only express herself pathologically through the control, bullying and dominance of him. And he could never then attain a Jungian level of understanding on things. But that's a very clear example.
It is, yeah.
But you see it all the time.
Yeah.
And you see people coming in for Jungian-based therapy and their problems are Freudian or Adlerian or both.
Yes.
And that's quite normal, actually. It is normal to have problems at each of these stages. But you cannot complete a Jungian opus unless you have resolved the Freudian elements and you've resolved the Adlerian elements. It backfires. You see it over and over again.
Yeah.
And very, very few, if any, of these internet psychologists are talking about that in anything like a meaningful way.
Yeah, no. I mean, I'm thinking about, I mentioned earlier about this idea of the boyo, for example. Boyo is more of a subset of the overall category, which is something like lost young men trying to find their way in the technological age.
Yeah.
Something like that. And it's like, well, what are the patterns, the behaviour that these people try to do to find themselves? And it's like, believe me, I've been there myself. It's like, well, there's no FAP is one thing. And it's like, okay, that's just something to take note of.
Yes.
And you've got things like meditation and mindfulness is hugely popular. So you might extract from what you said, well, that's clearly they're in a Jungian stage of development because of that. Or because of king, warrior, magician, lover, they're like, well, I'm clearly integrating my inner warrior or my inner magician, therefore I'm at a Jungian stage, I've surpassed it.
Yes.
But if you look at really where their instincts are going, moment to moment, day to day, it's a Freudian problem.
It is,
so
absolutely.
all of these people.
Yeah.
Well, Jung appears to elevate you. This is the
good
draw,
point.
I think,
Yeah.
is
Very
that
good point.
if you are struggling with a superiority complex, that you're not fulfilling your genomic potential, you're more likely, paradoxically, to be drawn to Jung, because at least you can feel elevated amongst his ideas, as if somehow that you have you've acquired a special kind of knowledge that other people don't have, and probably you have, to be honest, because the average person isn't reading Jungian psychology.
No.
And so it's at one level it's completely understandable.
Yeah.
It's almost as if it's an antidote in disguise.
Yeah.
As if to
Yes,
say you
yeah.
you could actually be doing a lot more with your life that you're doing, both instinctively, at a Freudian level, and an Adlerian level too, in terms of maybe denigrating yourself and putting yourself down and underachieving. So you can see why young people are drawn to him.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been there ourselves, so it's by no means a criticism of that people do that. And even in some of the Jungian case studies, for example, one that's mentioned a lot is about the I think it was Marie-Louise von Franz and her patient, the woman who lived on the moon.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And although this particular lady had gone over the event horizon into psychosis, nonetheless you could see that idea of elevation away from the mundane world in a compensation probably to get her to fill her own potential. But if you stay with that, if you stay with the fantasy and the woo-woo, you don't ever really solve the problem.
No, you don't.
You just keep somebody trapped.
And that Jungian stage as well, I've seen that if someone is in the Freudian stage and they feel themselves to be, say, spiritually enlightened, normally what happens is they enter into the Adlerian stage, they have a kickback. It's like they inflate up into, it's like, I think you described it before, it's like a flight away from the family in many ways. They get that thing, be like, oh, power, strength, let's go.
Yeah.
And they start asserting themselves.
Yeah.
It's one of the, these bits and pieces that I try and talk about, just as my own experience on the channel.
Yes.
That, for example, anyone watching who has experience with, say, people on Twitter and Twitter eggs and Twitter gurus, that's exactly what you're seeing. It's people expressing the Freudian stage they're either just coming out of, having dealt with it in an Adlerian way. You can see the way that they're expressing it. It's to get power, it's to extract money from people, etc. Look at me, I'm top dog, and that kind of thing. It's not a spiritually enlightened state.
No.
It's not, you derive it right down into who you are and what you are right now, biologically.
Yes.
The thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you could, I mean, there are, obviously not everyone, I don't wish to generalise, but some people who get into that state too also have problems with all sorts of addictions well, kind of running in parallel. And if you think about very often what's behind addictive behaviour, there's usually a problem with meaning in some way, which I think is what you're suggesting, James, that there is a lack of spirituality.
Yes.
I mean, to use Jung's own phrase, spiritus contra spiritum, for example, for people who have alcohol addiction. So the thing that they think it's going to give them, like you say, obviously it provides a level of security and status and so on, but it doesn't necessarily bring joy to their lives.
No.
And that's where meaning is to be found. Is in the everyday, the small things that bring you pleasure, that bring you joy, the handmade life, which we've talked about in the past. Those kinds of things, a life that you craft for yourself, a life that has meaning. So, as I think you're suggesting, if you get stuck at that, and somehow you feel that and it may be that you have elevated yourself in a positive way by increasing your own sense of status. That may be the case, but that's not the thing in and of itself that will give your life meaning, give you joy, give you bliss, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, you've not found the grail.
No, you haven't. Absolutely not. No. No.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll link those videos, the 3 ones that we did on addiction, down below.
Yes.
So it can be super useful. And some of the videos people keep coming back to now as well.
Right.
Be like, I think these are some of the best ones we've done.
Yeah.
For obvious purpose, they apply to pretty much everything, to be honest. It's the real heart.
Yeah. So beware of pathology then, in the sense that if you are carrying unanalysed Freudian issues, unanalysed and integrated Adlerian issues, you just cannot authentically attain a Jungian level, and you can't disguise it either. And this is where Adler really comes in, because he talks about things like private logic, feeding into neurotic alibis, and then a guiding fiction, which is your belief that you're doing something, and this concept of fictional finalism, which is a critique, if you like, in this context of teleology. And this idea that you're moving towards some kind of inflated goal and all that your behaviour should be directed in that way, when in specific pathological circumstances all of this is untrue. In your actual life, it's just a fantasy. And that's at the Adlerian level. How many people are at, they believe, a Jungian level and exhibiting all of those points I've just raised negatively in a pathological sense? You can see it, you can actually see it in people. And it's the same with the Freudian issues as well. You can see that bubbling as well away in people in the background. And when you get both of them as a mixed pathology, you know they will never authentically achieve a Jungian level at all.
Well, Jung just won't take. You can't just tack it on.
No.
It just doesn't work that way. Like you say, you know, we see lots of people are attracted to Jung, and yet those very people are into nofap. And you think, well, you know, never the twain shall meet. And when we were growing up, for example, the idea of, you know, masturbation was that it was just an innocent way of exploring your sexuality. And it's become something almost to be ashamed of. And to dissociate yourself from, and clearly instinctively that's a very unnatural and very unhealthy position to take on things.
It is.
Yeah, and it's certainly not the Jungian stance, but I get why people would if they start with the end of his career.
Exactly.
And this whole idea of like, I can imagine, I've spoken to people like it before. It's like, well, I can do active imagination, and I do like, you know, I draw mandalas and things like that. It's like I'm in sync with myself, with my body. I'm at the Jungian stage, and I've surpassed all these other things. But then when I'm talking to them in therapy, I'll you know, go toe to toe with their complex, if you like, and you can see beneath the eyes like a rage might come out or something, like, don't touch this.
You see a flash of it.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, so this is all basically a show. And as you were saying, like a guiding fiction, essentially. I'm enlightened, but really you're just isolating yourself off from what you should be doing at this stage of life. It's like,
absolutely.
When you come to the personal myth, those of you who want to do it, these are the pitfalls that you must avoid. You do have to pass through the Freudian stage. You do have to pass through the Adlerian stage, which is even more intense in some respects because it's reality-based testing about where you're at psychosocially. That's what Adler's all about. But the psycho part of psychosocially for Adler is challenge your private logic, challenge your neurotic alibis, those things that defend what your core ideas, your guiding fictions as well, which, if you like, is a kind of a pseudo or a false personal myth. You have to watch all of that. And have the courage to do so in order to pass through the Adlerian phase. But you can only pass through Adler by having proper psychosocial relationships.
Yes.
Then you can progress to the spiritual. If you try and go to the end, you're full of repressions. Those repressions will come for you, and you will interpret that probably as being the shadow, the dark side. It's the unanalysed bits of you, the bits you haven't integrated, which, yes, define your personal shadow, but you've created that by not sorting it out before you get to that stage. So the whole point then is to follow it through, and Jung himself was clear about that, but people avoid it. Freud first, then Adler, and then, if you're up to it, Jung. But people who don't follow that, then the Chinese have a saying about things which are either in the bone, in the blood, or on the skin. on the surface, blown away. And that kind of attainment of Jung is the latter, I'm afraid. It's not a true attainment. A slight breeze will blow it away. You have to go through the other stages.
Well, in the context of relationships as well, Steve, we've talked about individuation relationships, haven't we, on the channel a few times. Sexuality has to be a part of that as well. It isn't all about, uncovering archetypes and, working with one another in that way. There has to be a real physical and loving connection as well. There has to be at that biological level. You can't have an individuation relationship without sex. I mean, it's just ridiculous to even think that you could. And we've done a lot of work clinically with couples, and when couples get into this sort of pseudo-equilibrium state that John Destian talks about in his book Coming Together, Coming Apart, the first thing to go out the window is sex.
Yeah.
And that's usually because of the kinds of projections and transferences that are going on in the context of that relationship, so that the couple involved no longer see each other as they really are. And if there are parental complexes being projected, for example, then you get what he describes as being like an incest taboo, because obviously psychologically it doesn't feel right to be having sex with somebody that you've kind of coloured as one of your parents or somebody else's parents. So that's something to bear in mind. But in peeling off those projections and working through them clinically, then you find that couples start to literally, they come close both psychologically and physiologically, sexually, of course, and that's a complete thing then at that point. We're not just, like I say, dealing with people's psychology, but we're dealing with their biology as well, and the expression of it in the context of a loving relationship. So, it's you just cannot take Freud out of the equation. No. You can't. Everything falls down at that point.
Yeah.
No, it frames everything. It's like, can you individuate alone? Maybe, probably not.
Yeah.
Because, and again, if you ground it in biology, it becomes obvious.
Yeah. Yes,
That's why it's like, well, you're drawn to do that. That's where your libido should go. It's why, for example, the image of the anima for a man is a woman.
Yes.
We've been primed to relate to. It's not simply I am the spiritual man in and of myself. Though that is a valid path for some people. It's not like a suite of options you can just choose from and you're independent from them. So no, you've got a path to go through.
Yeah.
And I guess the psychopathologies cluster around 3 distinct stages. So I don't think we've touched on what a Jungian pathology would be, though, actually.
Yes.
Someone's at that stage.
A Jungian pathology will manifest itself spiritually or pseudo-spiritually, and a tendency towards psychosis. And in order to understand this, and this is a hard message and people won't like to hear it, you really have to look at what happened to Jung, in the same sense that when you want to understand Adler and why he came to his particular views, you have to look at his life, the context of his life and his personal myth. He was born with a physical disability, and he believed that strove him to overcome that inferiority, that organ inferiority as he described it. And out from that he developed his model, which is highly personal in some elements but very general in others. So if you apply Adler, then the best thing to do is to understand how and why he came to develop his model. Then take out the personal elements as much as you can. Learn from it but remove it. What's left is general, applies to us all, and it's very, very good. Same thing with Freud, and sadly the same thing with Jung. Where when you look at him and you want to see what went wrong with him, you're going to see what could go wrong with you if you follow him blindly. And that's really important. If you read Henri Allenberger's The Discovery of the Unconscious, published in 1970, he interviewed people who were classmates with Carl Jung before he achieved his doctoral status. He was such an authoritative work. You'll learn a lot. You'll learn a great deal. And one of those perhaps less than popular facts is that Jung worked with psychotic people for about 7 years in the Berkholsey Psychiatric Hospital. People who were wildly psychotic, unbuffered by any kind of medication in a modern sense. It was florid, it was all there. And then he left. And then for the rest of his his professional life, the next 50 years, more or less, he worked with wealthy neurotics. And Ellenberger points out that that's a huge difference between working with real people, ordinary, poor people, people who had nothing other than their illness to define them and the fact that they were incarcerated in a mental institution. And then he went and worked with rich people, people like members of the Rockefeller family, and people of that status and of that level with huge financial resources. And for the next 50 years, that was it. And most of his ideas came into written and formulated form over those 50 years. But when he went into medicine, he went in with two primary influences. One was his mother. His mother was superstitious in that sort of medieval way, and Jung describes her that way. And his father, who was a very strict Christian. So the imprinters onto his anima were his mother, but also his father's anima and his father's capacity to relate, which was expressed through Christianity in the form that his father had it and passed it on. He also had a spiritual medium in the family as well, and there were all sorts of peculiar people, should we say, on the periphery of his family who influenced him. And then he chose psychiatry as a profession, and he went in and was exposed in the raw to florid psychosis, and he did some of his best work in that period, particularly the early years, when he worked out his theory of complexes and applied scientific methods to analysing them. And then, he said it himself, he went mad. He became psychotic. And then it appears that he cured himself. Lots of Jungians say that he did that. He became insane and cured himself. And he kind of emerged out of that around 1921. And at that time he created psychological types, and he created psychological types as a way of understanding Freud and understanding Adler and how they came to create their theories based on their personal life and experience. It was their personal equation. Jung is clear about this, it's in psychological types. That was his justification for going his own way, including his period of insanity, his creative illness. So you can see that all three of them were heavily affected by their personal life, and then they created a model that reflected that, but there was something beyond that which was of value. So when you follow Jung, you have to understand that if you do follow him, you run the risk of becoming psychotic yourself. But there's a great deal of immense value in Jung's work too, but you do have to find it, you have to look for it, and never ever forget the context within which it was born, as he advises us to do with Freud and with Adler. And he says himself in video interviews that are available on YouTube, where he said he created his type theory in order to understand the difference between him and Freud, and also Adler and their psychology. So there's the big hint, and it's the same in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where he says, I undertake to tell my personal myth.
Yes.
That was it. His work, the totality of his collected works is his personal myth. That's what it is. You have to abstract out, you have to distill from that what is valuable. That's a lifetime's work on its own.
But it will free you as well, Steve.
It will free you.
It will allow you to see him as a human being and have compassion for his suffering, because to see mental illness in the raw, I mean, it's things are dealt with so quickly now. People are medicated so quickly. You don't see the kind of florid symptoms that he would have seen in his day. But it must have been incredibly shocking, and anyone with a fracture line would probably have been triggered by that.
Oh yes, and he did go in with a fracture line, without a shadow of a doubt. Why did he select the psychology of so-called occult phenomenon for his doctoral thesis? He was already primed for this, but he went in with that fracture line, and he did some of his best work, some of the best work that's ever been done on mediums, on dissociation and what was eventually called complexes. Although there were other people who were influencing him who are largely forgotten, like Pierre Janet, which is a great shame, because that man was well ahead of his time. So always understand the context of a psychological theory and its application before you decide to follow these people, because it could lead you into a specific kind of pathology. And if you haven't gone through the other two phases on the way, you haven't resolved any Freudian issues, any Adlerian issues, in other words, instinctive and psychosocial issues, you carry them forward into another set of problems which will be spiritual. That will just create a mess.
It's better to have a warts and all appreciation
Yeah.
of somebody, because then you can have that appreciation of yourself in that way too.
Yes, you can.
It allows you to be more self-accepting.
Yes, and forgiving.
And forgiving, yeah.
And if you work as a therapist, that's really important, to be able to forgive other people, you know, and not to treat them in the way that they are routinely treated in health services,
Yes.
particularly in the UK, where they're just nuisances and problems and
Yeah.
things and objects
Yeah.
to be medicated or use electroconvulsive therapy on or something like that, or even CBT, which is brutally dehumanising.
Yeah.
You know, bring your humanity to the table when you work with people. It's the most important thing. But when you learn from these great figures from the past, see them properly in their context.
I mean, we see a lot of young men at the moment who are ashamed that they've followed their instincts, maybe in a way that hasn't been that productive for them, and they're living with that shame.
Yeah.
And then that kind of then pushes them into nofap.
Yeah.
And so on. And I can remember you saying to somebody recently, Steve, that it was okay for this young man to have done what he did, because he couldn't have done it any differently.
No.
He was under instinctive pressure, and just that acceptance that, well, I've done that, but that's okay. I can accept myself for having done those things. Was liberating for him.
It was. Yeah. Your instincts will not forgive you for not actualising them.
No, but you can forgive yourself for having them.
You can forgive yourself for having them. By what I said, what I meant is that instinctive pressure, it will always be there.
Yes.
That's outside of your conscious will or intentionality. That they do push.
Yeah.
They can be satisfied, and sometimes through displacement. This is one of the gifts of Freud, really, that he did show how you can modify an instinctive drive. But if you don't accept it before you try and perfect or channel it into something else, you're going to develop a neurosis on the basis of that.
Yeah.
And if you attach that unactualized instinct to a religious idea, and by religious I mean in a psychiatric sense of religiose, which is a pathological term for any kind of woo-woo style belief, and it becomes woo-woo when you don't understand it yourself.
Yeah.
That's the important thing. And when I say about Jungian woo-woo, what I mean is people who don't actually understand what they're handling, what they're dealing with. It becomes religiose in a pathological sense.
Yeah.
You then back that up with instincts which are at war with you, and then a failure to adapt socially as well. You have the recipe for an absolute disaster in the form of a severe mental illness.
Well, yeah, and then I can feel almost like a voice coming through, echoing from the old days. Not in any kind of strange way, hearing the voices or anything, but it's saying, well, geniuses go mad.
Oh, yeah.
I remember that, because it used to be a thing for myself. It was, well, Jung and Nietzsche, they were geniuses and they went mad, didn't they? It's like, no.
Yeah.
It's almost
Wrong,
as if to
false.
suggest that you can't be creative unless you go mad.
Yes.
Which is ridiculous.
Yeah, it is. It is ridiculous.
There's nothing romantic in mental illness.
No,
Not
it's
at all.
suffering.
Yeah.
It's suffering.
Yeah.
But people don't have to suffer. And there is a pathology that comes from following Jung when you don't understand Jung's context and you don't understand what informed Jung. And Freud is being updated right now. In fact, for the past 20, 25 years, there have been serious efforts to bring him into the field of neuroscience and neuroscience into the field of Sigmund Freud. And this is the work of neuropsychoanalysts like Mark Solms, absolute breakthrough stuff. Mark Solms is a kind of genius. He's a very intelligent man. He is a psychoanalyst. He's a neuroscientist, a neurosurgeon as well. But his genius is in the syncretism, the blending together of these different elements in a meaningful way. But he's not like Nietzsche and he's not like Jung. He's an ordinary, highly intelligent, creative, academic and clinician who is quietly doing this work in the background. He will move this on. The future is in that direction, the future of psychotherapy, without a doubt. Great things are being learned there, and eventually neuroscience will catch up with Jung. But to start with, it's got to catch up with Freud.
Yes. Thank you for watching this episode of Jung To Live By. If you haven't already, make sure you download our free PDF for integrating your shadow. It includes the most advanced theory on the topic available anywhere on the internet, as well as a full practical breakdown. If you've ever wanted to integrate your shadow, this is honestly the way to do it. Thanks again for watching, and take care.